Hello and welcome back. So I had dental surgery today. I had a tooth cut out of my jaw, and so you may find me talking a little funny. It's a little bit painful, and so I may pause and come back from time to time. I want to get this posted for you tomorrow. So uh, today we're talking about democracy in Athens, which was a city-state, not an empire, but is pretty foundational. Its method of government for many of our today's states look back to Athens and definitely Rome, which we will be spending a fair amount of talking to and about, and definitely was an empire. Looked to the Greeks and particularly to Athens as a sort of a template for their own system of government when they became a republic. This is David Sansoni, the author of the book that this passage was taken from that you read. So, sort of an important inflection point in the history of Athens is the wars they fought with Persia. Um, so this was about 500 BC to for and raged for 40 years or so, right? And the Greeks won. I mean, they didn't conquer and take over Persia, but they did hold off the Persians, which were an enormous empire at the time, right? An ancient empire that we weren't going to be covering in any detail. Um, Very interesting uh, to study these sorts of ancient empires. It would be fun to do another class just on ancient empires. Um, if you've ever seen the film 300, it was pretty popular, I don't know, a decade or so ago. Worth watching. It's fun, and it's sort of a hyped up version of, a pretty hyped up scenario, which was the Battle of Thermopylae, when 300 soldiers, Spartan soldiers, held off the entire Persian Empire at sort of this narrow pass. Um, there were other battles in which Athens uh, was sort of the hero, of the Battle of Marathon, and so on. And uh, what, yeah. So at any rate, right, Persia was held off, and Greece was not incorporated into the Persian Empire. Was sort of central to the Greeks in their own character and such. Um, Spartans and Athenians, very different sorts of city-states and political uh, organization. The Spartans were well known as like fierce warriors, and they had a pretty intense sort of political and social system that was designed to create fierce warriors. Children were sort of brought up in a barracks, kind of communally trained in combat from an early age. Uh, the economy relied heavily on slave labor, as many economies in the ancient world did, but slaves outnumbered the citizens by a large percentage, and so they really needed a strong military to keep that place from revolting and keep their way of life in place. So, yeah, as I said, Sparta and Athens, they teamed up, they worked together, they did uh, prevent the Persians from taking over. So, oh, and so the reforms we're going to be talking about, this all happened uh, prior, for the most part, to the Persian Wars, but in some sense it explains uh, the ascendance of Athens after these wars. So the what we now know as the country of Greece um, was populated by independent city-states, right? And some of them went, some of them were beyond what the current boundaries of Greece, but still probably would have considered them city-states that affiliated themselves with Greekness in some way. Um, Early on, they tended to be oligarchies, so that meant the richest, most powerful citizens, or was they weren't necessarily officially citizens yet, but the richest, most powerful folks in a certain city, right, would kind of get together and run the place. Um, this is a common way that political organization will arise if the scene is relatively informal. Maybe there's not any kind of written constitution or anything yet, but people with the most power, may come to some sort of agreement. There may be some fighting and some machinations, political machinations, but they'll come to some sort of stable sort of handshake agreement on how the city should be run um, to their. Um, once in a while, one of those oligarchs would decide that they wanted to be the only one in charge, and will sometimes achieve that either through, again, political wheeling and dealing, or maybe some violence, um, and would end up making himself, and in these days he's a tyrant, right? So nowadays the word tyrant has bad connotations. At the time, that was just a word for a single ruler of a city state. But pretty early on, even in the Greek city states, it, it got that bad connotation, in part because, right, the Athenians, after their reforms that we're going to talk about, looked back on those times as the tyrant of the tyrants as pretty evil and anti-democratic, right? Um, but still not quite the same connotation as we have now. It was in recent history to them, so uh, it wasn't, it was a specific term that evoked actual memories, right? So, what we're trying to explain partly in this lecture is, so after the Persian Wars, um, Sparta would seem to be the obvious choice to sort of take a leadership role among the Greek city-states, um, since they were the strongest military presence, but they chose not to do so. They were kind of an isolationist sort of, city-state, and chose not to go after that role. And Athens moved in to sort of fill that vacuum, and they were sort of poised because of their particular political system to take sort of the leading role that they began to take in Greek city-states, and became sort of the center of culture. If you philosophy, you talk about Socrates, Aristotle. We'll read from Aristotle in a bit, and on to Alexander the Great, right, who was the Macedonian, but still, Greekish, who took over the area of Greece, and then much of the known world at the time. So uh, there's something about this inflection point after the Persian Wars that Athens' particular way of doing things seemed to give them a prominent role. We're going to talk about what that way of doing things was. So definitely different in character, Athens, than the Spartans. Uh, Began as an oligarchy, as almost all of the other city-states were, right? But then there was a particular kind of economic crisis happened where, if the rich will tend to get richer and the poor get poorer. We're sort of used to this in our own time. But beyond a certain point, inequality can become so extreme that, like, all of these smaller landowners are driven deeply into debt, right? Deeply into poverty. And then in that day and age, that meant potentially driven into slavery, right? So you could become a slave just by being a debtor, right? And eventually you would just owe your labor to someone, in eternity, if not, for all intents and purposes, if not sort of in principle. If you're working off the amount you owe, and the amount you owe is more than you could ever work off in your lifetime, you're a slave. So um, there was beginning to be a threat of civil war, right? Just as in Sparta, you get enough slaves and enough of the lower classes, there's a risk of revolt. Sparta had the strong military to keep the status quo, but Athens wasn't quite the same kind of state. And so instead, um, what they did, these opposing sides appointed a single citizen that they all respected to help resolve the conflict. This is 594 BCE. So I don't know if I've mentioned it yet. A word on these. Colloquially we talk about BC and AD, which means before Christ, and Anno Domini, year of our Lord. So basically after Jesus was born. Um, Nowadays, scholars, if you read a history journal article, they'll talk about BCE, before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era, which means AD. I'll kind of flip between them because sometimes you might find it confusing. BCE might be hard to remember if you're not used to it, and there's no harm in saying AD and BC as long as you know. Okay, so the person that they chose was named Solon, and he negotiated a settlement that created sort of a new blueprint for the political organization that became ultimately the Athenian democracy, with some help from uh, a later guy, Cleisthenes, that we'll talk about in a moment, right? But this was the beginning of the democracy of Athens as we think of it. So he created a hierarchy of classes, And which class you belong to was based on the amount of produce your land could create. So it wasn't necessarily square footage, right? But it was like how productive was your land. But there were classes that didn't require you to own land. So you could still be a citizen even if you don't own any land, but the higher classes would own land and they would own, again, more productive land. This was pretty radical at the time in the ancient world. I mean, there were even periods in the early US where you needed to be a landowner to vote and things like that. Um, so anyone could be a citizen, but again, in the ancient world, anyone doesn't include women and slaves because that's just the way they thought. So he made this that sort of concession to the lower classes, right? You can be a citizen without even owning land. Again, to make this compromise, he has to make some concessions to the upper classes. And so the hierarchy he created gives more power to, right, the people higher in the hierarchy. So there were four tiers of citizenship. And then certain political offices like treasurer only available to people in the highest of the four. And members in the lowest class couldn't run for office at all, but you could vote in the assembly, and they had an assembly that all citizens were eligible to vote in. So one important result of making this hierarchy dependent on wealth, rather than say aristocracy, right, and inherited uh, titles, right, from previous ages, right now, it's just based on your land, and that means you can move up, right? If you can get more land or farm your land more efficiently, you can move up in the hierarchy. You can even reach the top, right? So no permanent sort of blood-based aristocracy, which means um, this setup is appealing to the lower classes. We'll find that, I mean, this is the case even in the U.S., even sometimes the poorest of us, right, who really and realistically maybe have a very small um, probability of becoming billionaires just because of the way sometimes the deck is stacked against you, will nonetheless love the chance, right? That we want to strive often and will take a chance to be a billionaire over maybe a different organization that would give more right to the lower classes. So this sort of carrot of like you could become one of the rich ones too, very appealing and carried a lot of weight, like, compromise trying to broker. Um, Another thing that made the system appealing to the lower classes, and again thus prevented uh, conflict, was a expansion of judicial rights. So you had more rights under the law. Um, One of these was appeal to the people, right? So if a state officer, whatever, decided to tax you in a certain way or to convict, right, accuse you of a crime or something else, you could appeal again to a vote from the assembly, which included many common people, and you might have your case go in your favor. Um, Another important thing about Solon's laws, they were written down, right? Um, they weren't just sort of, again, folk ways of doing things in the oligarchy or sort of handshake deals and so on. They were standardized, written form, and so in principle accessible to anyone, right? And therefore much harder to, right, trick anybody. Everybody could appeal to the same uh, right standard laws. Um, Granted, you could read, right? Not everyone could read at this time, but you could find someone trustworthy to read the laws for you. Right? So just having these laws written down and accessible to everyone had a democratizing influence as well. Okay, so as I said, one of the classes of people that don't count as citizens are slaves, and part of this conflict that precipitated Solon's sort of laws was that people were slipping into the lower classes and into slavery, right? So slavery was common in the ancient Greek world and common really in all ancient societies. Um, some slaves in Athens and in Greece were owned by the state. So like the state of California would own some slaves, right? There'd be federal slaves, kind of thing. Um, and this was, I mean, right, translate that in the state of Athens would own some slaves and they would be used for public works and so on, right? Um, Sometimes the slaves even served as a sort of police force. So all sorts of government type work was done by slaves. Um, but the majority of the slaves in Athens were privately owned, and they would serve as laborers in the household, right, in the fields, um, in the house, and as household servants and so on. They were the basic labor force. So there's a name for this form of slavery. It's known as chattel slavery. Um, the root word is shared with the English word cattle, right? So um, you get a sense of what sort of status this folks had. You could be bought and sold just like a cow, right? Could be bought and sold, and you pretty much had no more rights than a cow, right? So worked however they wanted, beaten and whipped however you wanted if you owned a slave, often branded, right? Like a cow with the name of your farm or whatever. Lots of sexual violence against slaves. So not a good state, right? And not so different. Form of slavery practiced in the United States, right? Before the Civil War, also chattel slavery. Uh, the justification, right, that people came up with uh, for treating other human beings this way was to say, well, they're not really human beings, right? They're more like cattle. Um, this sort of ability to convince yourself that right the person you're abusing and working, uh, or sexually abusing is like okay somehow was because often they were barbarians, right? So this was the Greek word for anyone who didn't speak Greek. Right? So their language sounds like they're saying barbar. Um, so slaves came in often through war, right? So you fight with those states, you win a war, you take a bunch of their soldiers and their people as slaves, um, and then once you've got enough slaves, you of course those slaves can have children, and so that you can breed your slaves to create more slaves. Occasionally, if somebody owes you a lot of money, they might end up your slave. So those ones would be a little harder to, imagine if it's your neighbor or someone from a farm next door that borrowed a bunch of money from you and then becomes a slave. That I could imagine it would be harder to mistreat them on quite the same level, but folks that don't even speak the same language as you and come from what you consider to be, barbarian civilization, uh, they found ways to convince themselves that these people were inferior, right? Okay, so we had Solon's reforms, right, and it worked, right? Crisis was averted. We had a new political system with the possibility of moving up, but with some privileges, uh, held aside for the higher classes, right? And so everyone seemed to be happy for a while. Um, but at least among the upper classes, there were still disputes. Um, and just as in the oligarchy, right, this, again, power wrangling among the rich and powerful uh, resulted in one of them seizing power and establishing himself as a tyrant. This was Pisistratus. His rule lasted about 50 years, held together in part by his ability to stay in touch with the people, right? So the interesting thing about the Solon's laws stayed, right? He didn't abolish the laws, and that meant that the lower classes still had a certain amount of power. And so for Pisistratus to stay into power, he needed to stay right popular among the lower classes, and he accomplished that by throwing a lot of parties and feasts. Um, and just in whatever ways, right? If there were any relatively cheap ways to keep the lower classes happy and keep your power, it was um, what else has all happened this time? So Athens is much of it is not great farmland. It's pretty rocky and mountainous, but what they do have are olive trees, right? And olive oil was a prized commodity, and so um, Athens was doing pretty well trading olive oil. They also made very great pottery, right? Um, so a lot of people were getting rich, right? There was upward mobility that was promised, right? And Solon's hierarchy was happening for people, right? They were making more money. They were expanding their land holdings. They were producing more and rising up in the hierarchy, right? So this was good for Pisistratus, right? Because he could then all those people, right? If he can stay in those lower classes' good graces as they rise up, gives him more power against fellow aristocrats. Eventually, Pisistratus was no longer tyrant, and Cleisthenes um, moved in and sort of like recognized the power of the lower classes, right? And enacted a series of reforms, in part to prevent future tyrannies, right? There's always, to the Athenians in general, tyranny is a bad thing, right? So he enacted some reforms to try to take sort of Solon's template and refine it. And so he carved the entire Athenian city-state into a bunch of districts. The text goes into a lot of detail on the names and exactly how many were in each one. It's not like you have to memorize that sort of thing, but the main idea is that these districts were entirely new and replaced the more traditional sorts of political districts, like which were family-based tribes, right? So you had certain tribes of people that were like uh, well connected to each other, often lived in similar areas, and would often have similar interests and may sort of vote in blocks. Well, he's trying to sort of deliberately get rid of that and create sort of new teams that everyone could sort of be on. Um, and the citizens went along with this, which is fairly, modern and forward thinking of them, and maybe illustrative of something special in the Athenian character, right? That they would go along with this rather than their old ways of teaming up with their tribal tribal teammates, right? So the districts look like they were designed to maintain a sort of representative cross section of the population. Um, and so from these smaller districts, he then created 10 new tribes, right, with brand new names that replaced the four traditional tribes. So again, yeah, pretty clearly trying to get rid of the old affiliations and create new ones. They had a sort of a representative council um, of people that were elected, like our Senate or House or something like that. So it was expanded from 400 to 500, and each tribe had an equal number of representatives. So 10 tribes, 50 each, 500 members of the representative council. The job of the council was to set the agenda for the General Assembly, right, in which all the Athenian citizens could vote. It was like a direct democracy, and the only job of the representative part of that democracy was to decide what people would vote on, basically. So the smallest kind of district was called a deme. Every deme would have at least one member on the council, right? So even if you were the smallest one, you would have at least one member representing you in the council. A larger deme might have as many as 22 members on the council. This word deme is the root of the word democracy, right? And the idea was, and in effect, I think it provided more power to each individual citizen, right? So if your little town had your own representative that could go in there in the council and at least, start wheeling and dealing, what, one representative of your council is not going to be able to win against if 499 of the other councilmen will oppose them, but they're in the game. They can talk to people. They can make deals, right? So it is a democratizing kind of system for sure. The As we'll see is common often in empires later on with the Romans. There's a mapping of the political organization and the military organization. Tribesmen will fight alongside each other when they go to war, and the subsequent military successes in Persia sort of prove the effectiveness. I mean, it's an interesting uh, method of warfare that the Greeks had. So it was literally like, oh, the Persians are coming, right? We need to defend ourselves against them. Everybody from your town, you had to provide your own swords, your own armor, right? Um, but it's like as if the town of Burbank, right, went down to fight the Persians and met up with the folks from Pasadena, right, and you were there, and maybe your roommate and some of your classmates, and the person that owns the hardware store, and the professors and so on, right? So, and we all had our own homemade armor, and we form up, right, into it's like a real tight formation. We'll see this when we talk about the Romans because they borrowed this from the Greeks. you'd be called a hoplite, right? That's the name of the soldiers, and they would, it was like cutting and slashing and arrows and throwing spears, right? And it's particularly visceral and like personal and terrifying, right? Um, so uh, yeah, I don't know. Fun. Again, this isn't like a military history class. I'll try to throw it in when I can, but it's something that's interesting. It's an uh, area to study. But like the phalanx was is like all these hoplites would sort of like stand together, kind of like a little porcupine or something, and it was a useful formation, pretty impressive formation for like preventing uh, missile attacks. Right? If people shoot arrows and you're all bunched together with your shields, you can pretty much repel the arrows, creep forward, and then get into a melee attack with your soldiers, and it worked well for the Greeks. So one more innovation that was attributed to Cleisthenes, the convention of ostracism. So the goal was to prevent any one person from gaining too much power, to prevent tyrants, right? So an ostracon is just the name for a broken piece of pottery. So pottery was ubiquitous in the ancient world, right? Your olive oil, your Tupperware, right? Everything, it was pottery, was your like main storage. And so they would get broken, they would get old, they would leak, whatever. And so there were shards of pottery around. And so every year the assembly would vote first on whether they even wanted to do an ostracism in a year. If a majority says yes, we want to do an ostracism, then another vote would be held later on in that year. In that vote, everyone would get a little broken piece of pottery, an ostracon, and write down the name of someone that they want to be ostracized. And if somebody got more than 6,000 votes, right, then they were ostracized. If there were two people that got more than 6,000, then whoever got the most votes would be ostracized. And what it means to be ostracized is to be banished from Athens for 10 years. Right? You gotta leave. You're given like 10 days, get your stuff, get out of there. Then, when that 10 years is done, come back, right? No hard feelings, um, no permanent penalties imposed. You can pick back up, right, where you started. Um, so, I mean, I provided a mechanism for if someone started to look like a dangerous political figure, they were gaining power, you were worried there might be a tyrant, right? You could prevent that, kick them out of town, but you didn't have to like assassinate them because whenever you start killing, then there's going to be a revenge and it can escalate into a civil war. So we thought like a lower stakes way of just getting this problematic person out of town for a bit, and hopefully that their supporters would not take that to be a reason to like for a civil war. Okay, so summing up, I think this is a relatively short lecture, is relatively short reading. We'll talk about Aristotle next, and then that'll be sort of all the time we devote to the Greeks. But this is not an empire, right? Athens was not an empire, but there was a later empire, a Macedonian empire that included the area that right? Alexander the Great, you may have heard of him. Um, but one of the reasons that I want to cover Athens is it sets up this tension that reoccurs throughout the course, right? So you need to keep the peace, um, which usually means you need to give some kind of carrot to the lower classes, right? You can't let them get so upset that they have nothing to lose and they'll just as soon kill you, right? Because whatever, if they die, they die. They're going to die anyways. In ancient world, right, slavery of the lower classes were often like poverty or starvation level, right? So you need to give them something that prevents them from wanting to engage in a revolt. Um, and that will be a democratizing giving them any sorts of rights. Now you're moving in the direction of democracy. You may not move as far as Athens moved, right? Um, but the more power you give them, right, the more that power can be used by populist demagogues to create their own personal power. So if I can appeal to the masses and the masses can vote or have some sort of power, then I can use that greater power, right, to my own benefit and become some kind of tyrant. Um, so kind of the whole point is to prevent tyrants, but it gives right the fuel for tyrants to take over, and we saw that with right from Solon to Pisistratus, and then these increased sort of methods by Cleisthenes of trying to strengthen the tyrant prevention, but it's never foolproof. Right? All right. Well, then I'll see you next time.